Hey everybody, this is the Right Geek with another installment of my Iron Man Things series. Today we're going to go on a tangent because one thing I neglected to mention in the prologue to this series is that I come from normie stock. And by that I mean that I did not start with the Iron Man comics, I actually started with the movies. So um, I have one foot in normie world, and I love normies because I was one. As you can see, my Funko Pop dolls are holding my notes in place, so that is a clear demonstration of my normie roots. And I decided that what I needed to do is just shout out to all the normies out there who have been watching the movies in the MCU. I love you guys. I'm one of you guys. I love the MCU immensely, even though in many ways the movies are very different from the comics. But I still love them because that is where I started. And I'm not going to hate on anyone who just watches the movies or doesn't really have a lot of familiarity with the comics, because until recently that was basically me. So what I have here is I have this little Venn diagram that I drew out, where it was me basically analyzing the differences between MCU Tony Stark on the right here, and 616 stable era Tony Stark on the left. And by stable era I mean the Tales of Suspense and Volume 1 era, which is the decades in which the character was written most consistently, in my opinion. And obviously that's where the character and his lore was officially established in the 616 canon. And what I did is I wrote down, okay, how are these two versions of Iron Man, how are these two versions of Tony Stark different from each other, and then what do they have in common, as sort of a normie orientation for any normies out there who maybe are interested in looking into the comics and seeing what they're like. All right, so first of all, let's talk about the differences, and then we'll get to what they share here in the middle. Yes, cough squad assemble. Still coughing. Sorry about that. All right, so first of all, what I wrote down here was the differences in terms of relationships. They both characters carry that Playboy label, but the interesting thing about Playboy Tony Stark in the MCU is that actually gets abandoned fairly quickly. He in the movies, he's established as a Playboy in his previous life, or before I am, as we say. But then after that, he really just has the one girlfriend whom he eventually marries and then has a family with. On the other hand, 616 Tony Stark, in the stable era of Tales of Suspense in Volume 1, has many relationships, and I wrote in parentheses, which often end badly. As we go further in this series, I'm going to talk about ways that for 616 Tony, he often loses girlfriends to either death or sometimes outright betrayal. Which is kind of sad in a way. Okay, so another difference that I kind of outlined for myself here is what about psychologically what's going on between these two different versions of the character. And I came up with the fact that MCU Tony, he is explicitly portrayed as an anxious character. He say what you will about the flaws of Iron Man 3, but I did like the PTSD aspects of that movie, and I think, this is just my personal opinion, I also think that MCU Tony Stark also displays signs and symptoms of attention deficit disorder. So that's kind of what's going on with him. 616 Tony, on the other hand, he seems to be a more depressive and more reflective character. When he's upset, he kind of goes off by himself and kind of there's several panels through time where we see him holding out his Iron Man mask in kind of a Hamlet-like pose, and sort of thinking to himself, "You are the reason for my problems." So in the comics, he tends to be more sad than anxious or jumpy. Then we have the big theme here that in the comics, the alcohol use is a plot point, and it's treated as a serious lifelong problem. Whereas in the MCU, we do see Tony drinking, and we do see him drinking to excess, but the movies don't really address that as this is a lifelong addiction that he has that he has to deal with. It's more of a the drinking is like what he did in Iron Man 2 at his birthday party. It's more of a he does that when he's feeling particularly under stress and wishes to self-destruct, but it's not something that is an issue that well, at least it's not treated as an issue where he actually needs intervention. In the sense of he actually needs to go into treatment. Then we have here difference number 3. Tony Stark in the MCU, he very quickly disengages himself from the business aspect of SI. He seems to want to spend most of his time, at least when he's not with the quote unquote super friends, he spends most of his time tinkering and being the quirky inventor, and that seems to be what his preference is. On the other hand, the 616 Tony Stark in the Stable era is a much more engaged business leader. He's much more hands-on and much more involved in the day-to-day activities of his company, and has his hand in company policy. There are many comics, particularly in Volume 1, where we see him in board meetings convincing other leaders in his business, hey, we need to do X, Y, and Z because this is my vision. And we don't really see that aspect in MCU Tony. I think MCU Tony would just rather stay in his garage. So that's the difference there. The next difference would be that 616 Tony in the Stable era, he seems to be more comfortable in the team setting. Though sometimes, if he feels it necessary, he will go off on his own if he notices something that the others don't, or if it's something that he takes personally, he will go off on his own. But in the Avengers books, at least the ones that I've managed to read so far, it seems like most of the time he's willing to go along and cooperate and try to work out strategy with the other members of the Avengers. On the other hand, MCU Tony, very clearly his natural inclination is to be the lone wolf who does what he wants. And the whole concept of a team and checking in with the team and roping the team into things that he's thinking about and plans that he has is something that he struggles with basically through the entire MCU canon. Though, we do see growth in the sense that, at least on the battlefield, he's willing to take orders from Cap. But you see, even as late as Ultron, if Tony has an idea in his head that he wants to push forward, then he's going to do it because Tony Stark does what he wants. So uh, so there's much less inclination on the part of MCU Tony to cooperate with others. Uh, okay, then we have another major difference in that 616 Tony Stark has a secret identity that he goes to frankly ludicrous lengths to protect through all of Tales of Suspense and Volume 1. Um, whereas, whereas MCU Tony, I wrote down, you know who I am. Because the MCU decided from movie 1, yeah, we're not going to do the secret identity thing. Screw that. Um, uh, One more difference. 616 Tony strikes me as a little more mature. He's not 100% serious. He is capable of being jokey and quippy when he's fighting with villains, but he is not the veritable joke machine that MCU Tony is. MCU Tony, obviously, he uses humor as a defense mechanism. He uses humor basically to cover the fact that he's scared poopless. And so a lot of his scenes are on the humorous side. And then lastly, the last difference that I can think of between stable 616 Tony and MCU Tony is how deep his relationship is with Cap. So I put down here for 616 Tony, there is a much deeper Iron Cap romance. Part of that, I'm sure, is a function of the fact that in the comics, they had several decades to develop that relationship. So obviously it's going to be a lot deeper and a lot more detailed, and they're going to share many more experiences together than Cap and Tony in the movies. They were only, when you think about it, they were only in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 movies together. That's not a lot of time to build the sort of relationship that's built out of shared experience. So in the MCU, the Iron Cap romance is barely there. I think the movie that had the most of it was probably Endgame. But otherwise, it seemed like most of the time it was written more as a mutual respect / rivalry, whereas in the comics, their relationship can sometimes become an argument or a rivalry, at least in the stable era. But there are also experiences that they have where, for example, Cap will teach Tony how to defend himself. There's a very famous sparring scene in the very famous Demon in a Bottle arc where Tony has been deprived of his armor, so he goes to Cap and says, hey, can you teach me a little self-defense? And they have the sparring scene together. And we have also in Volume 1 when Tony disappears into his year-plus long alcoholism relapse. In one issue, Cap actually tries to intervene. So those are the kinds of friendship-building experiences that you don't really see in the movies, mainly because the movie just didn't have enough time to get into that kind of level with any of the characters and their relationships. All right, so let's get to the middle. What do the two characters have in common, besides, obviously, the fact that they are Iron Man and that armor is their thing? So I wrote down, first of all, daddy issues. Neither Tony Stark likes their father very much. We see late in Volume 1, there are several issues where we get an up-close and personal look at 616 Tony's relationship with his father, and it is just as fraught with conflict as the implied relationship between Howard and Tony in the movies. So they have that in common. I also wrote down armor addiction, armor as escape. This is also kind of a later Volume 1 thing. When Tony is dealing with his paralysis and his neurological issues, he starts spending more and more time in the armor, because in the armor, that's the only place where he feels like he's completely in control of himself, and he feels like he doesn't have to depend on others when he's in it. Which kind of brings me to what I wrote down here, the idea of the need for mastery. Both Tony Starks share this need for control over their circumstances and control over their own destinies. And obviously, armor as escape is a big thing with MCU Tony, too. That is, in fact, one of the principal things that was going on in Iron Man 3. He was dealing with this trauma, and the way that he decided to deal with it was to build like 50 suits of armor, because he didn't feel safe, and he thought that pretty much the only way he could feel safe was to surround himself with tech. So they both have that in common. They both have this reliance on tech as a means to control their environment. Both characters will also periodically get worn down by the Iron Man role and want to quit. So there are several times in Tales of Suspense and in Volume 1 where 616 Tony even tries to quit for a bit, until we get to the other similarity that both characters share, which is that the guilt as motivator. So a couple of times in the 616, Tony will try to quit as Iron Man, and then inevitably something bad will happen while he is taking his little Iron Man vacation. And then he'll say, well, I guess I can't quit then, because when I do, bad things happen. I mentioned before that sometimes 616 Tony will go off on his own to deal with something, and most of the time, the reason for that will be because it's something that he perceives as his fault, and that therefore he's the one that needs to go in and deal with it. And then obviously, guilt as motivator is also something that pops up in the movies too. In Civil War, in particular, they make it extremely explicit that Tony's motivations, at least in that movie, are 100% driven by his own guilt. We have, I wrote down fits of anger. So we have, for example, in Iron Man 3, when Tony gets swarmed by the press vultures outside of the hospital after he visits poor comatose Happy there, and he gets pissed, challenges the Mandarin to a cage fight.